welcome everyone who is participating in this Australian Institute of International Affairs Queensland chapter sponsored webinar. We are very fortunate tonight. Oh, my name's Colin Forrest, by the way. I'm a member of the Council or Executive Council of the Queensland chapter of AIIA, and I'm hosting tonight's webinar. I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, Ms. Leanne Smith. Leanne, you will have all seen from the invitation to tonight's webinar, is a very, very qualified and esteemed person to be speaking with us tonight about this subject of the United Nations Sustainable Development Guidelines. Leanne's the director of the Whitlam Institute in Sydney and has a lot of great experience behind her, including working within the Australian judicial system, the Australian Human Rights Commission, working for DFAT as an Australian diplomat, and very recently working as Chief of Policy and Best Practices for UN peacekeeping operations out of the United Nations in New York. She served in that capacity for some time in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and in South Sudan, the world's newest country. I think South Sudan is. That's not that. I think that's correct. Leanne is an adjunct fellow at the Western Sydney University School of Law, a visiting fellow at the ANU, Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy, and the UNSW, Australian Human Rights Centre, and she's a goodwill ambassador for the United Nations Association of Australia. I'll hand you over now to Leanne, and if you have any questions, most of you will know the drum. Hit the Q&A logo at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and it'll come through to me, and we'll look at them. I'll have a look at them, and we'll put them to Leanne when she finishes her presentation. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Colin, and hello everyone. I'm sorry I can't see you all. This is the way we do business these days. It is just gone 7 o'clock in Sydney, and very grey skies here all week long as well. So I think it's going to be a long wet week. I'm coming to you from Dulwich Hill in Sydney, which is on the land of what was and always will be the Gadigal Wongal peoples. And I'd like to pay my respects to any elders or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us tonight. As Colin said, I have quite a mixed background in the law and international affairs. My passion has always been international human rights law, and having the opportunity to see how I suppose law and policy at high levels actually work on the ground in places like Afghanistan and South Sudan, and trying to learn lessons about what works and what doesn't at the pointy end of some very high legal concepts. So my experience with the UN has been in the field and at headquarters, as Colin said, and just as I was finishing up my time in New York, I was involved a bit in the design of the Sustainable Development Goals, which took about 10 years to put together, working with 193 member states and all the different parts of the UN system. So I was particularly involved with SDG 16 around peace, justice and strong institutions, because that's where peacekeeping logically fit. I wanted to just share with you a little bit of information about the Whitlam Institute for those of you who don't know our work or who might be interested in getting involved with any of our work. The research I'll be speaking to tonight was commissioned by the Whitlam Institute. We sit in the building you can see behind me, the Female Orphan School in Rydalmere, as part of the Western Sydney University. And when Gough established the Whitlam Institute, he asked us, and I quote, to help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. So some pretty big marching orders, but certainly the kind of thing that someone like me found very easy to get behind when I came on as director of the Institute. Part of the work we do under that mandate is policy research. And at the moment, we're doing policy research under two themes. The first theme is Australia in the world, how we engage with the world, how we can broaden out both how we think about what engagement means beyond foreign and security policy, and also how we can broaden out the conversation about international relations to reach a broader Australian audience. The second theme that we do policy research around is the future of Australian democracy. And one of the reasons I was interested in doing some work on the SDGs is because I think they provide a fantastic bridge between what Australia does in international relations and how Australia runs this society, this economy, this country. So it's something that Gough was very well known for, Gough Whitlam, in terms of using international law and international conventions to advocate for domestic policy change, and sustainable development goals fit squarely there. But I don't want to go any further, assuming that you all know the SDGs the same way that I do. So given I was sitting in a rather large group of former and current policymakers a couple of weeks ago, and I asked them all if they knew what the SDGs were, and 90% of them didn't. I thought it might be a good idea to start by a quick explanation of the SDGs, and rather than me talking at you, I thought it might be a good idea for me to share my screen just with a very short video produced by the UN about what the SDGs are and what they might mean for us as a global community. I hope you can see that now, and I'm going to play that. Oh no, I'm not. There I am.
We can be. We must be. The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation
Most determined
to fight injustice and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done. The global goals.
the 15-year plan.
For everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
We will live in a world where nobody
Anywhere lives in extreme poverty. Where no one
goes hungry.
Where no one wakes in the morning asking if there will be food today. We will live in a world where no child has to die of
Diseases we know how to cure, and where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
We will live in a world where and education gives us the knowledge
And skills
for a fulfilling life. We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities to thrive and be powerful and safe.
We cannot succeed if all is good.
We will live in a world where all people can get clean water,
And proper toilets
At home, at school,
at work.
we will live in a world where there's sustainable energy for everyone,
Heat, light,
and power for the whole planet.
without destroying the planet.
we will live in a world where economies and new wealth
Lead to decent jobs,
for everyone.
and we will live in a world where our industry
Our infrastructure and our
Best innovations.
are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
we live in a world where prejudices and extremes of inequality are defeated.
inside our countries,
And the change their countries.
where people live in cities and communities
That are safe, progressive,
And support everyone who lives there.
where we replace
What we consume. Planet where we put back what we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back and threatening climate.
change.
where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas.
Will restore and protect
Life on land,
Forests, animals,
the earth itself.
With peace between and inside countries.
where all governments are open.
And answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
And the justice rules.
With everyone equal before the law.
Where all countries and we their people.
Work together.
Partnerships of all kinds. To
Make
make
these
these global goals a reality.
These are the United Nations global goals.
For sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
So I hope that wasn't too dull for those of you who already know about the SDGs, and I hope it was brief enough to give you a sense of what they are if you haven't come across the Sustainable Development Goals before. I suppose if there was one word I would use to describe what you just saw, it's ambitious. And I suppose that's why the 2030 agenda has a 15-year time frame, and why it builds on 10 years of the Millennium Development Goals that came before these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I thought I'd just say a big difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, if you're not aware, is that the Millennium Development Goals were really targeted at developing countries. So the way Australia engaged in those goals was largely through its overseas aid program, and it was about how we could help those countries achieve those goals. With Sustainable Development Goals, 193 nations, including Australia, in 2015 signed up to these goals, not just as foreign policy objectives, but as commitments that sovereign governments would take on themselves to implement in their own countries. And that's a big difference that hasn't really been appreciated, I don't think, in Australia yet, that the SDGs are about us, not just about other countries. So why this research for the Whitlam Institute? I suppose coming back to Australia in 2016 after having been away for a very long time, I was surprised that nobody knew what the SDGs were, and I started wondering why that was. You may remember, some of you, that in 2018 the Australian Parliament ran an inquiry into the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. They reported in early 2019. And they had a list of 18 recommendations around how Australia could do better at implementing the SDGs. So I saw that parliamentary inquiry happening, and I wondered what was happening to those recommendations. One of the recommendations from the Australian Parliament was that Australia should look to international best practice to see how we could do better here. So I thought, why don't we have a look at how other countries are doing around the world, and offer this piece of research as some constructive contribution to helping the Australian government meet its international obligations that it's taken up through the SDG agenda. So that was kind of the rationale for why we got into it. And then I had to find somebody who could lead the research for us. And that person happened to be a very wonderful woman from the University of Queensland, Dr. Claire Brolin, who I've spoken to earlier today, but I don't think she's going to be with us tonight. So Claire is an academic at the University of Queensland, and she focuses on intersecting global health and development policy, equity and rights issues around the SDGs, and how Australia and countries of the Asia Pacific can implement the SDGs. And because she wasn't able to be here with us tonight, I thought it would also be appropriate for me to share a very short 1 minute interview I did with her about this research, where she kind of articulates why now more than ever this conversation around the SDGs is an important one. So let me see where she is.
COVID-19, our recent bushfire crisis emergency, really concerning drought that's occurring throughout Australia, really demonstrates how we really need to get serious in this country in terms of implementing the SDG agenda. You know, personally, I think what's really lacking from Australia is a futures vision. And I think more than ever, this is what is needed to give hope to to Australians as we go through this particular COVID-19 emergency, and we see the economic, particularly the economic, social and environmental fallout, all the three pillars of sustainable development. And I think this is where we really should be leveraging and harnessing our SDG commitments. I think it's a pivotal moment, I think, in this country's history to really be thinking about future visioning beyond defence and really thinking about, okay, let's be serious and let's implement the SDG agenda.
So that's Dr. Brolin, and I'm sorry she couldn't be here to present this with me tonight, but she did a fantastic job. She'd been following the parliamentary inquiry, and she used a very interesting methodology to produce the research for us. So firstly, she reviewed I think it's 190 odd recommendations, sorry, 190 odd pieces of evidence that were provided to the parliamentary inquiry from a range of government departments, civil service organisations, businesses, international organisations. She also conducted an extensive literature review of what's being written globally about SDG implementation. And she also went to New York during the General Assembly in September last year to talk to a number of diplomats and policymakers from different countries that we'd identified as having good practice in implementing the SDGs. So you may have seen from the flyer about this evening that the three countries that we decided to look at for best practice were very different countries. We could have gone straight to the Nordic countries and been assured that we would find a range of good practices that, you know, the rest of the world was trying to keep up with, as is the case on a lot of policy issues. But we wanted to identify countries that were relevant to Australia in different ways. So Claire interviewed and conducted research on Germany, Mexico and Indonesia. All countries that Australia has long-standing relationships with, and different bilateral, regional and multilateral common areas of interest that cross over each other across different areas, from, gosh, disarmament to trade to migration and so on. So these were the three countries that Claire looked at to kind of identify some key findings about what makes implementation of the SDGs successful, some examples of good practice from those three countries, and she also came up with some key recommendations about what Australia could do based on that research. So let me take a moment to talk you through some of those now. So you may not be surprised to hear that in terms of key findings, the primary things that made a difference in countries that were doing well at changing their society, at improving their economy, improving in social issues and taking care of the environment, implementing the SDGs was really all about, first of all, leadership at the highest level within a country, and secondly, once the leadership was in place, attaching funding and money to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. We wanted to look at what happened in Indonesia and Mexico and Germany to get a sense of how that would help Australia. And some of the things that we learned from those three countries, and I'm just going to get this up on the screen for you as well. And I'll note that this is Claire's research the research slides that I'm sharing with you. In terms of the case studies, what was effective in relation to Indonesia. Slide 2. Can you see that? Are you able to see that slideshow?
We've got, but still, it's still showing the first slide, the opening one. So
okay, fantastic, thank you. So in relation what made the implementation of the SDGs work there were some of the examples were, first of all, there was a national, some of you may know Bapanas, the National Development Planning Organisation exists for this kind of purpose and was instrumentalised to lead the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, a good practice that we've identified is that Indonesia went from having policy around the SDGs to having laws about SDG implementation, and in Indonesia that was through Presidential Decree number 59. Indonesia's also done a fantastic job, and probably partially because of its extensive relations across the UN system and the UN family, in building the language of development policy and planning within Indonesia around those Sustainable Development Goals. In Mexico, some of the examples that made implementation effective there were a dedicated effort to make SDG education, training and awareness part of policy making and government officials training.
Leanne, can I just interrupt you? Are you able to move through the slides, because we're still the slide that's on?
Oh, I apologise.
That's okay.
Oh, I may not have that level of aptitude. Right. I apologise. I'm looking through them, but I thought you could see them. Sorry about that.
You can only see them down the left-hand side, but yeah, it's not the big one.
All right. Well, I might stop sharing the screen and I'll just
talk to them.
Speak to them. Yeah. So I was saying about Mexico, 3 things that we can learn from their experience is training policymakers and government officials about what the SDGs are. That's a nice start. Attaching budgets to the plans that they have for implementing the SDGs, so through a national SDG budgetary planning process, and nominating SDG champions within each government ministry to raise awareness about the SDGs. And in relation to Germany, you know, we're a bit behind the 8 ball when we look at Germany, because the first German Sustainable Development Strategy, including national sustainability goals and targets, was launched in 2002. So they're well ahead of the game, and the language of sustainability and sustainable development has really become part of the fabric of German government, German policy and German society. So that's created a clear taxonomy around the concept of sustainability. But additionally, Germany has in place, and certainly something we could also look to, a parliamentary advisory council on sustainable development that keeps things moving along. So there's some of the good examples that we looked at. And in terms of our own recommendations for how Australia could do better at implementing the SDGs, maybe before I go to the recommendations though, some of you might be thinking why it would be good for Australia to do this. Maybe not, but some of you might be thinking there are many other frames for how we can improve the quality of life and the quality of the environment and the economy in Australia. This is not really a necessary framing, I suppose. But there are a few reasons why we think the SDGs do provide a good framing for Australia as we think about a roadmap for futures thinking in the middle of all of the crises going on for us at the moment. So just to mention a few of them, in our view, the SDGs can provide a much needed national futures policy vision, as Claire said, and a framework for how we move forward, which could help support the future proofing of Australia for generations to come. Another reason would be that a commitment to the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals could support the Australian business community's confidence in the Australian government, in the sense that the Australian government would be demonstrating strategic leadership and its ability to handle complex futures policy challenges that the private sector is very well aware of. Another reason would be that alignment with the SDG agenda could serve Australia's regional soft power leadership, as well as our national defence ambitions in the Pacific region, consistent with the Pacific Step-Up policy. Countries in the Pacific take the SDGs very seriously. And finally, but certainly not leastly, in our view, the implementation of the SDGs can improve the quality of life of every Australian, particularly the most marginalised Australians. So that's partly why we think it's worth looking at. And then I'm not going to go through all the recommendations with you because I think we had 12 of them, but just to give you a flavour of what's in the report, if you're interested to look further, the first recommendation relates to that point about leadership. And that is to say that Australia needs to establish a national framework for the SDGs. We can't just look at one over here and one over there, or leave it to business or leave it to the community. We need to have a national framework, and we need to have a national implementation plan for how Australia is going to not only demonstrate that it's making a change domestically, but also report against our international obligations. Another recommendation is around prioritising financing the implementation of the SDG agenda. We've recommended that each parliament should establish a standing committee, as we've seen in other countries, to help promote the agenda and to raise awareness, right down to the local government level, where a lot of activity is happening but may not be being cast in terms of the SDGs in a way that we can report against them. We recommend that if there is a national, through COAG or the National Cabinet, if there is a national implementation plan, that high-level body should have an advisory committee of academics, business leaders and NGOs to provide advice directly to ministers and the Cabinet on how to implement the SDGs. And maybe more ambitiously, how we could turn those commitments that we've made under international law into legislation. But for lawyers, I suppose you might not find that too ambitious, given that Australia is, under our own law, not supposed to take on any international obligations that it doesn't intend to meet through domestic legislation. So maybe there's some room to move with that one. So there's some of the recommendations that you can find in the research. And I suppose the question for us at the Whitlam Institute now is, where do we go from here? Because we were hoping to get some policy traction with politicians and senior civil servants around this research. We hosted a policy roundtable, but unfortunately, although we could get business leaders, peak bodies, NGOs, academics to the table, we were unable to get much policy traction with politicians and senior Commonwealth civil servants. So that was disappointing, and I think pointed us to the realisation that until there's greater awareness of what the SDGs are, why they matter to the world, why they should matter to Australia, and how they could help Australians, particularly marginalised Australians, if there's no appetite in the community or no awareness in the community, then it's going to be very hard to get that kind of political appetite. So through this network and other networks of people outside government advocating for and working for the SDGs, we're now looking to do some awareness raising and some mapping. We're going to start with some pilot mapping in our own community in Western Sydney to see if we can identify things going on in our community that are effectively about the SDGs, whether it be about water quality, whether it be about access to education, whatever the issue might be, so that we can help raise awareness of the framing, that this is a contribution to our SDG commitments, that it's a contribution to sustainable development for Australia, and hopefully raise some more awareness that way. But I suppose before I wrap up, I thought I'd just share with you some of the outstanding questions in my mind about the SDGs and how we do the implementation in Australia, and perhaps you have some questions around that as well to share. But a question in my mind is Australia making progress against the Sustainable Development Goals in spite of a lack of federal government leadership? And I suppose when I was talking to business leaders and community leaders, I asked them whether that matters or whether they're content and happy to continue working on these issues without that kind of coordinated federal leadership. And the answer was no, that having a clear steer from the Commonwealth Government and from Commonwealth departments would be very helpful to their own efforts to make achievements with the SDGs. I suppose another question in my mind is, do the current circumstances we're facing, in 2020, from fires to COVID to water access issues, recession, drought, do these circumstances or these confluence of things coming together for us as a nation, do they create a new light for how we value the SDGs as a tool or a framework for taking us forward into the future? Another question I have is, where is the federal government on this now, since issuing its voluntary report to the United Nations last year? It's very hard to find any information from the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet or the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are co-hosts of the government's engagement on the SDGs. It's very hard to find any updated information. And if we're not going to get any traction under this government, what would it take to raise awareness and get a commitment from a different government, from either political party, and what could we be doing now to raise awareness with future governments about why this is an important agenda for them to be aware of? So we're actively trying to pursue some conversations around that as well. I think I might leave it at that. I've been talking for quite a while, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions or give any more detail that I can about our work or this research. And I'd also just like to invite any of you who are interested in this topic or engaging on this topic from Queensland to reach out to me after the webinar, and I'd be glad to connect with you and see what we might be able to do together. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Leanne, for that very interesting introduction to the Sustainable Development Guidelines. I haven't received any questions as of yet here, but I was just interested in what you said about there being no traction yet with any, effectively with any politicians, federal politicians. But just quickly Googled whilst you were talking the notion of, parliamentary groupings in Canberra, and immediately there comes up a long list of parliamentary friends groups, and what there's some amazing ones, parliamentary friends of Australian music, parliamentary friends of Australian basketball, but relevantly there's parliamentary friends of better cities. Dave Sharma, member for Wentworth, is the chair. There's parliamentary friends of bushfire recovery, Rebecca Sharkey's on that one. Parliamentary friends of climate action, again, the contact persons there are Rebecca Sharkey, Helen Haynes, and they're the co-chairs, Zali Stegel. That might be those two, the cities one and the climate action one, might be a good place to start to generate some interest in maybe forming a group of parliamentary friends of sustainable development guidelines.
That's a really great idea, Colin. But I think what you pointed out just there is kind of a reflection of what we're not getting about the SDGs in Australia, which is that it's about futures thinking about how our environmental future and our economic future and our social future are all related, and why those 17 goals are interchangeable, and we can't be thinking about no one living in extreme poverty without thinking about environment. It's that interconnectedness that the SDGs are all about. And while you can get traction in Australia on a specific issue like future of our cities, it's very hard to get that overarching framework. And I guess I wonder whether anyone is thinking along those lines. Rather than, Australians are known to be very practical people and problem solvers, and maybe it's easier to conceive of these things individually than as being interrelated and part of an integrated future.
Susan Rockcliffe asks, is the lack of support from the Australian government for the Sustainable Development Guidelines an illustration of a downplaying of the importance of the United Nations in general in this country?
Gosh, I'd love to know what you think about that, Susan. On several fronts, I think. Well, look, we see Australia very supportive on certain issues, in relation to the UN. In my own experience of peacekeeping, Australia did fantastic work around gender issues, around conflict-related sexual violence, around protection of civilians. I would say that we probably haven't approached multilateralism and the UN in recent years the same way we would have under the Whitlam government or the Hawke and Keating governments. And we've certainly placed a higher role on bilateral and regional relationships. And I did an interview with Penny Wong recently, and we were having a discussion around how when we talk about the UN in Australia, it's usually about how busted it is and how we need to fix it. But we very rarely reflect on what it stands for and why Australia was part of establishing the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter, and that maybe that was worth us standing up for rather than just detracting from, I admit, the myriad of problems that the UN faces. But there's this assumption here that anything to do with multilateralism is at the expense of our sovereignty, and that for me demonstrates a real ignorance of the whole underpinning of the international system, which is of course based on sovereignty of 193 member states and is part of the problem that it has for that reason.
Melanie Dixon asks this. She makes a point first. She says, Oz Harvest is part of the SDGs in regards to food rescue and fighting food poverty. Then she asks, are there any more social organisations like that which are part of the SDGs in Australia, to your knowledge?
There are, Melanie, and I'm just looking for, there's a network in Australia, well, there's a global network of which there's an Australian arm called the SDSN, Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And there are a lot of great organisations operating through that. There's also operating out of Monash University in Melbourne, there's the National Sustainable Development Council. And there's one other, I'm sorry, I'm just churning through some pages here. There's a place where you can add your projects that are relevant to the SDGs where all of the different projects that are relevant are represented. So for example, we put our research up there, but all kinds of organisations are putting up their projects, saying why they're important and saying which goals they contribute to. And that is through the National Sustainable Development Council website. So you can find that there.
Now, you may know Paul Lucas, Leanne. Paul, the former Deputy Premier of Queensland and esteemed chair of the Queensland chapter of the AIIA, has asked a question. He makes a statement to start with. This is about first Australians and closing the gap. He says, it's pretty clear that Indigenous-led and controlled health services, rather than paternalism, have had the greatest success in many countries, or successes in many countries. In Southeast Queensland, our own Institute for Urban Indigenous Health has been the national leader. Would you care to comment upon this at all?
Thanks, Paul, for the comment and the question. I can't speak to Southeast Queensland and the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health, but I would be really glad to learn more about the work being done there. I can say from my experience working in the Middle East and Africa that I absolutely concur with what you're saying, that Indigenous-led, locally owned, locally designed, locally controlled services of any kind are the only way to make anything stick, anything be sustainable. I was involved in the UN high-level panel on peacekeeping and peace building, and certainly one of the number one things to come out of that process was a recognition that if you don't, in a peacekeeping context, if you don't bring the people you're there to serve with you from the get-go, and that doesn't just mean the elites of the government of that country, but if you're not really working across all of a society, representing everyone who's part of that society, then you've got very little chance of success the UN was interested in that, because if you're trying to take people from conflict to prosperity, you'll never be in a position to leave if you can't cross that bridge. And my work with the UN in peacekeeping with civil society definitely reflected that too. Unfortunately, I think, as you probably know, taking the approach you're talking about, Indigenous-led approach and locally owned processes and delivery, can sometimes take more time and can sometimes take more money than some governments or taxpayers are willing to spend. So that can be an impediment to taking the right approach to these kind of issues, I think.
Leanne, another one of our members who you may know, and another former Queensland leader, Penelope Wensley, who was our governor, has thanked you for your presentation and asks, did you include media in your policy roundtables? Penny says, we need more reporting of the UN in positive terms to lift and change the public debate here about the UN and, inter alia, influence awareness among politicians of its relevance and value to Australia.
Thank you, Penny, and lovely to see you here, at least in text form. We did invite media. I was able to get a piece in the Lowy Interpreter about this research and about the SDGs, but there's very little interest in this topic. We did a piece in The Conversation, Claire and I as well, but I have a sense that the SDGs may not be the lowest hanging fruit in terms of getting Australians more engaged with the UN more broadly. I think it's perceived as too complex an issue, and that's partly because there's been such poor communications around it, I think.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions before we conclude for the evening? We've got any people who are participating from south of Queensland who might like to ask some questions? Doesn't look as if we do, Leanne.
All right.
All right.
I think I'm not in a position to put anything into your Q&A feed, but Colin, I'll share with you the link to our research, which has also got a good summary if people don't want to read the whole thing, and it's got a longer interview with Claire and I about the research in case people are interested. I'll share that with you to circulate to the group.
All right. And one of our anonymous attendees just wrote, thank you very much. This has inspired me to find out more. So if you can give us that link, Leanne, that would be great. We might be able to inspire some more.
I will. Thank you very much for that.
It's been wonderful hearing your presentation tonight. I have really enjoyed watching you present and listening to you present in front of that beautiful building that the Whitlam Institute is so fortunate to occupy in Rydalmere in Western Sydney. And for those who didn't hear, before we started tonight, I was asking Leanne about that building, and Leanne told me that it's the oldest building built in Australia that's still standing. Is that right?
It's the oldest 3-story structure in Australia, built before Hyde Park Barracks by Governor Macquarie. Yeah. And
the Whitlam Institute is a very fitting organisation or institute to occupy that building and ensure that it stays part of Australia's built and educational heritage for many years to come. Thank you so much, Leanne. I look forward to speaking again soon and working with you again at some stage in the future.
Thank you, Colin. I look forward to that too. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone who joined in tonight. I'm sure you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. Adios.
Adios.